Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first story in particular involves a veteran explorer drawn by curiosity into a hole where his exploration turns into a life or death struggle. As for the second one, it's even more painful to watch. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On January 31st, 2014, the cold Tennessee air settled over the rugged landscape as Marion Smith and Jim Fox set out for another day of exploration. The two experienced spelunkers had planned to survey an unknown cave, mapping its tunnels and searching for new passages hidden beneath the Earth's surface. It was a routine they had followed countless times before. After hours of navigating tight passages and carefully documenting their findings, they emerged from the cave, exhausted but satisfied with their work. But just as they were preparing to leave, something caught their attention. A small, barely noticeable opening in the rocky terrain. It was an unnamed karst feature. A karst feature is a natural landform created by the slow dissolution of soluble rocks like limestone, dolomite, or gypsum. Over thousands or even millions of years, water seeps into cracks in these rocks, gradually eroding them and forming underground drainage systems, caves, sinkholes, and other unique geological formations. These features can include vast cave networks, deep sinkholes, underground rivers, and disappearing streams. Because of their unpredictable nature, karst landscapes can be both fascinating and dangerous, with hidden tunnels, unstable rock formations, and sudden collapses. Most would have overlooked it, but to seasoned spelunkers like Smith and Fox, it was an irresistible discovery. It was a narrow curved passage that they thought led to unexplored sections of the cave. Since the Earth had been shifting for thousands of years, shaping tunnels and chambers deep below the surface, there was no way to know which kind this was unless they checked. Curiosity took over. Fox worked to widen the opening just enough for Smith to enter. The 72-year-old had spent decades exploring places like this, squeezing into impossibly tight spaces, trusting his instincts to guide him through the dark. He lowered himself into the hole carefully, his hands pressing against the damp rock as he descended. The walls were so close that it felt like something was swallowing him whole. That was because from inside, the space was small and constricted. But soon the excitement went away. Smith's headlamp revealed nothing but dead ends. There were no tunnels, no passages leading deeper. It was a disappointment, but he already knew that not every hole led somewhere. He prepared to climb back out, twisting his body into the best position to push himself upward. However, at that moment, something was wrong. The exit was right there, barely a body's length away, but he couldn't move the way he had come down. The tight space was working against him, pressing against his ribs and shoulders at the wrong angles. Every attempt to climb up only made him slip lower. A cold realization settled over him. He was stuck, but this wasn't it. He didn't know that moments later, this nightmare was about to turn into something even worse. From above, Fox saw him struggling and immediately moved to help. A rope was rigged and a foot ascender was passed down to Smith. He reached for it, trying to get the right leverage, but then his headlamp illuminated something that sent a wave of unease through him. A large slab of sandstone rested above him, barely held in place. It was cracked, unstable, a heavy mass just waiting for the slightest shift to send it crashing downward. He recognized the danger instantly. If it moved, it could trap him. Worse, could crush him. And then, while he barely had enough time to process his dire situation, a deep, grating sound filled the tunnel, stone grinding against stone, followed by a sudden, violent crack. The boulder plunged downward. He was already wedged tightly and had barely enough space to breathe. Now the heavy rock worsened his misery. He was being crushed against the cave walls. Pain exploded through his body. His unusual curved angle in a constricted space made his body twist, making everything feel 100 times more miserable. The weight of the rock crushed his thighs and hips, pinning him. His breath caught in his throat as a sharp, burning agony radiated through his lower body. His ribs felt like they were on fire, his legs completely immobilized under the unrelenting pressure. He tried to move, to shift even an inch, but the rock didn't budge. During that time, all he could feel was his life was being sucked out of him. Fox reacted immediately. He went in the hole, pressing his hands against the boulder, trying to lift it, push it, move it in any way. But it wouldn't give. It was wedged tightly, impossible to shift by hand. Time passed in a haze of pain. Smith found it difficult to breathe, his body trembling from the pain and shock. The pressure on his legs was unbearable, sending waves of agony through his entire body with each passing second. Fox grabbed a small shovel and started digging. If he could remove enough dirt around the rock, maybe he could create space to free Smith. But the ground was unstable. Every scoop of dirt caused other rocks to shift, creating the risk of an even bigger collapse. After several desperate attempts, they realized the truth. This wasn't going to work. They needed help. Fox grabbed his radio with shaking hands and sent out a distress call. The words felt heavy as he spoke them. Smith was trapped. It wasn't a simple rescue. It would take a team. Minutes crawled by. Smith's body ached, the pain growing worse with every passing moment. His muscles had begun to cramp under the unyielding weight, and the cold air was seeping into his bones. He had spent his entire life in caves, but now the very thing he loved was threatening to bury him alive. Every minute felt like days, and then finally, help had arrived. A team of experienced cave rescuers and emergency responders flooded the scene, assessing the situation. There was no easy solution. The rock was too large to move manually, and the space was too tight for heavy tools. A new plan was made. A second hole, parallel to the first, was dug. The goal was to tunnel beneath Smith and remove the rock from underneath. It was a slow, delicate process. Every movement had to be calculated. Every piece of dirt removed carefully to avoid triggering another collapse. Smith was in agony. Hours had passed. His body was screaming for relief, the pain growing unbearable. Medical personnel arrived and administered an IV, providing fluids and pain relief. It dulled the sharpest edges of the suffering, but not the terror of being trapped, helpless, unable to move. Then came a new idea. Clinton Elmore, one of the rescuers, had experience with rock removal. He knew the type of sandstone that had pinned Smith, and he had an idea. It wouldn't shatter into flying debris if handled correctly. Instead of trying to move the boulder by force, they would weaken it strategically. A small hole was drilled into the rock. The rotary hammer sent vibrations through the stone, a deep rumbling sound filling the space. The pressure was unbearable, every jolt sending fresh waves of pain through Smith's body. But then, something shifted. The rock moved. It wasn't much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Elmore reached down, wedging his hands beneath the massive weight. His muscles strained as he pushed with everything he had. The boulder lifted, just enough. Smith didn't hesitate. With the last of his strength, he dragged himself forward, his entire body screaming in pain as he inched past the crushing weight that had held him prisoner for 6 long hours. And then, he was free. The cold night air hit his face as he emerged from the hole. The tension in the air finally broke as the rescuers cheered, relief washing over everyone. Smith's body was weak, his legs numb from the pressure, but he was alive. A helicopter waited nearby. He was flown to the hospital, where doctors checked him over. Miraculously, he had no life-threatening injuries. His body was battered, aching, but intact. Just a few hours later, he checked himself out of the hospital. Days later, reflecting on the horrific nightmare, he would say that he had explored so many caves, checked so many tight spaces, that the odds had finally caught up with him. But deep down, he knew the truth. This could have been his last adventure. Yet, by sheer determination, luck, and the hands of those who refused to leave him behind, he had survived. This next story highlights how crucial it is to have the basic necessary equipment before you enter into dangerous sections of cave. On 3rd February 1997, Matt Gore and his 2 friends entered Grassy Cove Saltpeter Cave late in the evening, expecting an adventure. They were not experienced spelunkers, but they had read about the cave online and thought they could handle it. The plan was simple: get in, explore, and get out. None of them wore helmets, none of them carried extra lights, and none had told anyone where they were going. Their gear was minimal: cheap flashlights, a few snacks, and some water. The cave was mesmerizing and silent except for the sounds of their footsteps. They walked deeper and deeper, squeezing through tight passages and stepping over jagged rock formations, relying only on their dim beams of light. The deeper they went, the more treacherous the terrain became. Loose rocks, uneven ground, and slippery surfaces made every step uncertain. Still, they pushed forward, adrenaline keeping their doubts at bay. By midnight, they reached the waterfall room. A towering underground waterfall crashed down into a pit below, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The way down was sheer, but they were confident they could make it. Matt went first, lowering himself carefully. His hands grasped at the damp rock, feet searching for holds. His friends watched as he slowly descended. Then, a rock shifted beneath his weight. The crack of stone breaking filled the chamber. Matt barely had time to react before the entire ledge beneath him gave way. The rocks tumbled with him, hammering his body as he plummeted. He hit the bottom of the pit with a sickening crunch. Silence followed, save for the sound of falling water. His friends stood frozen at the top. They called his name, their voices trembling, but there was no response. One of them decided to climb down, leaving their equipment behind. The descent was reckless, done in sheer desperation. He slipped and nearly fell multiple times, but managed to reach the bottom. Matt lay crumpled, barely conscious. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, pooling on the rocky floor. His skull had taken a severe hit, his nose was broken, and he struggled to remain awake. His fingers were dislocated from the impact. Every breath was a struggle. Every slight movement sent pain shooting through his body. His friend knelt beside him, terrified and unsure what to do. Then, their lights flickered. One by one, the batteries gave out. They were plunged into total darkness. Panic set in. The two remaining in the pit had no way of climbing out, no way of seeing their surroundings, and no way of knowing how bad Matt's injuries truly were. The friend above had the only remaining light. He had no choice. He had to leave them behind and find help. With his cheap flashlight barely cutting through the blackness, he scrambled his way back up. His hands were torn on the jagged rocks, knees bruised from slipping repeatedly. The darkness seemed to close in, pressing against him. Every sound, every breath, every movement felt amplified in the oppressive void. He had never felt so alone. But he had to keep going. The climb took forever. His light dimmed further, barely holding on. And then it died. Total blackness. He fumbled in his pockets and found a Bic lighter. Flicking it on, he created the faintest glow, barely enough to see inches ahead. He held the flame close to the walls, using it to navigate inch by inch. The heat singed his fingertips, but he ignored the pain. One wrong move and he would fall, joining Matt at the bottom. 3 hours passed before he finally reached the entrance. He burst out of the cave, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. He ran for help, stumbling through the woods, not stopping until he reached a phone. Rescue teams were called. They assembled their gear, coordinating an extraction. Hours later, the first rescuers entered the cave. They carried ropes, medical supplies, and proper lighting. The descent was slow, cautious. The ground was unstable, and every step risked another fall. Matt was slipping in and out of consciousness when they arrived. His breathing was shallow, his body broken. The rescuers stabilized him as best they could, securing him in a stretcher. The ascent would be excruciating. He would feel every jolt, every pull, every shift of his battered body. They began to haul him up. The rope creaked under the strain. Each movement sent shockwaves of pain through his shattered bones. He gasped in agony, barely able to stay conscious. The rescuers struggled against the narrow walls, against the weight, against time. They had to get him out before he went into full shock. Halfway up, a rescuer lost his footing. He slipped, pulling on the rope. The sudden shift sent Matt swinging into the rock face. His scream echoed through the cave as fresh waves of pain ripped through him. The rescuers held on, securing him again. They couldn't afford another mistake. Every second dragged into eternity. The walls felt like they were closing in. The blackness seemed alive, watching, waiting. But they kept climbing. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they lifted him toward the surface. It took hours. When they finally emerged, dawn was breaking. Matt was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. The damage was severe: skull fractures, an epidural hematoma, multiple broken bones. But he survived. His friends, shaken and traumatized, never entered a cave again. Matt Gore's condition was assessed by doctors upon arrival at the hospital. The medical team identified multiple skull and facial fractures, an epidural hematoma, and severe neck and shoulder trauma. He underwent emergency surgery to relieve pressure on his brain and stabilize his fractures. Despite the severity of his injuries, doctors managed to stabilize him, and after several days in intensive care, he was moved to a regular ward for further recovery. The incident highlighted critical mistakes made by the group. They lacked helmets and proper climbing gear, failed to carry adequate lighting, and had no backup plan in place. Their failure to inform anyone of their location left them vulnerable, and their decision to descend without securing a safe way back nearly resulted in a catastrophe. The lack of proper equipment and experience almost cost Gore his life, highlighting the importance of preparation and safety in caving.